This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with John Porcellino. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this interview episode, we have the pleasure of talking with John Porcellino. The latest issue of King Cat Comics and Stories, number 76, has just come out. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials that sometimes will be at 45% off cover price, although sometimes they're 50% off cover price. But you know, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, and since we're talking to John Porcellino in this episode, it's worth noting that this month at DCB Service they have, Drawn and Quarterly has two of his books available to order, Map of My Heart at 25% off, and The Hospital Suite at 30% off. So you can pick up a couple of the books that we talk about in this interview at a good discount.
That's right. And you can find John's books and others at dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, this was a fun conversation.
Yeah. I like talking to John, and we get into not only King Cat Comics number 76, which just came out, but get into a broader discussion of his work as a whole and the progress, or the kind of progression, I guess, of his style and his sensibility throughout his career. So it's a good kind of career overview conversation that we end up having.
Yeah, it is. And at the same time, for those who are unfamiliar with his work, is a great introduction as well.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and give that a listen.
So we're here with John on this episode with John Porcellino, whose new issue of King Cat Comics and Stories, issue number 76, has recently come out. So thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks.
And actually, I had a question to start that kind of transitions from issue 75. It seemed like issue 75 was kind of a big hit for you. Is that the case?
Well, I mean, yeah, to call it a hit feels kind of because it's it's about my cat, and it's not the most. I mean, it's got obviously has plenty of funny stuff in it, but it's her life story, so it ends kind of in a tearjerker, but
right.
But I mean, the response was great to it, and that was gratifying for me. I mean, it was that story I worked on for quite a long time. She passed away in 2007.
Uh-huh.
So, about 8 years worth of work. Not 9 to 5 every day kind of work, but working on the story here and there and pulling it out and putting it away and working on other stuff and then pulling it back out and tweaking it and editing things and working on it a little bit at a time over that period. But I'm not always too pleased with the results of my work myself, but that was one where I felt obviously pretty strongly about it, and I just wanted it to be a really good issue. I wanted it to be a suitable tribute to her. Mm-hmm. So, again, it was gratifying that it got the response that it did. That was felt good.
Yeah, I apologize if calling it.
No, that's
kind of disrespectful.
Okay. That's okay. I mean, I always felt funny because usually, people will order an issue and I'll put a note in there like, oh, hope you enjoy the comic or whatever, and it's just a funny thing because I hope that it is enjoyable in some way, but it's also kind of sad. And of course, I heard from so many people who had gone, had similar life, cat companions who were so important to them, and everybody ends up crying and getting all tearful, and so it's kind of a weird thing to say. I hope you enjoy it,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I hope death is a part of life, and obviously it's not all about death. That issue, it's about her life, which includes. Right. Which includes death, but yeah, so it's always a little bit squishy to walk around those certain words that we're used to saying.
The reason why I wanted to kind of start with that question though is because just from my own perception of, say, like social media and so on, a lot of people did respond to it very strongly, and I know. I think, for example, I think it was Charles Hatfield used it in a class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's been a lot of copies.
Yeah, there's been a few classes that have used the book, and it's kind of a funny story, but I might as well put it out there for people to know. But there was like a very slight printing error with the first run of them. And so I ended up getting all these copies that the print shop didn't charge me for. And so I can't get rid of a zine, because it's like, wow, it's got this little imperfection on the cover or whatever, but the rest of it's 100% just fine. And so it occurred to me that it would be, I have all these kind of spare copies that I'm able to get to teachers, educators, librarians, or whatever for a very, cheap rate. I basically ask, it covers my expenses and postage and stuff and a little bit extra. But it's been kind of fun to have those extra copies to be able to get into classrooms affordably, because I know, especially a lot of teachers nowadays, the way things are, all that stuff comes out of their pocket. So it's right. Been it was a kind of a stressful period while I was trying to deal with getting the printing done correctly, but it turned out to be kind of a cool way to actually get this particular issue out into, more unusual classrooms and libraries and stuff like that. So if there are any teachers out there who would like copies of King Cat 75 to use in a class or something like that, just get in touch.
I'll talk to you about that.
Sure.
when we get done here, because that would be great. So I guess I was getting a sense from that kind of the social media discussion and so on, was that 75, the first issue of King Cat, probably for a lot of readers. And so I was wondering what the transition might be for somebody if they enter King Cat Comics with number 75 and then come to number 76, which is
very
kind of
different.
closer to a traditional issue of King Cat. So what are some of the things that kind of somebody who's new to King Cat Comics or new to the type of King Cat Comics might expect when they get to number 76?
Well, I mean, so 75 is basically one long, it's like 45 pages or something like that, story, which is something that I've only done a few times, really, in my time as a cartoonist, where I do a really long, extended story. And so for me, something like 50 pages, I think my book, Perfect Example, the story, Perfect Example itself is, I don't even know, but I think it's like 72 or 80 pages. Hospital Suite, my book from, I don't know if it was last year or the year before.
2014, yeah.
It's 3 longer stories, maybe 80-page to 100-page stories. But generally speaking, I work in very small pieces. So, the average King Cat story, I don't know what it would be, but it's probably 2 or 3 pages, maybe. I do a lot of one-page strips. So something like King Cat 75 is, with the extended story, is definitely unusual for me. But at the same time, like 75 was, like when I sat down and had was working ahead in advance and planning the next couple issues, it occurred to me, 75, that, first of all, the nice round anniversary issue of 75 was coming up. It happened to fall on the 25th anniversary of King Cat, 25 years. And it had this kind of special story of mine that I wanted to, had been wanting to get out there for a long time. So when I kind of looked a little bit forward on the calendar and figured out, that all those things could kind of align, that was my thought, that just to do something a little bit different and maybe a little bit special for the 75th issue and the 25th anniversary. And so it is a little bit unusual. I also had the benefit with that issue. That was the first issue of King Cat ever to be distributed through Diamond. Diamond Distribution, which was done through Alternative Comics, their little stable of kind of sublisting small publishers and working together and stuff, their little co-op thing that they have going on. So that was really cool, too, because that issue got out into a lot of stores that, I deal with a lot of stores directly myself, but that issue, because of that, was able to get out into other, shops and into people's hands that might not otherwise have been able to come across it. And I was kind of glad that, that issue was the one that went out because it was so special to me, and I thought it would be a good kind of introduction for people. But then when I was doing this new issue, I was like, yeah, I don't know what people are going to think about this if they come at it, after issue 75. I think 76, like I said, I'm not one to usually get too jazzed about my own work, but this one in particular, I went through a week or so of real self-doubt where I was just like, I don't know, man, this is going to be a kind of clunker issue, and it sucks because maybe there is this audience that kind of jumped on at 75 and they're going to pick up 76 and go, what the heck is this? But I feel happy with it now, and the thing that I've tried to do my whole time in comics is just let King Cat be what it wants to be, and I don't twist its arm to try to make it something it's not. And so, this issue is not only a lot of really short stories, but the stories themselves are oftentimes one line or 2 lines or something. So they're almost like little haiku poems, really minimalist poems. It's got 9 pages of letters to the editor that built up over the course of the past 3 years. And, I finally let the dam loose. So it is kind of an oddball issue, but, I've done so many at this point that it's part of the way it is. And every once in a while you put an oddball issue out into the world and people, the response has still been good, for the most part from people. So, but I get to a point where you just can't think about it. And it's just, this is what I do and this is how I do it. And this is the next one in the stack.
Now, is 76 going to come out through Alternative Comics and Diamond as well, or was 75 just a kind of one-off thing for that?
Yeah, no, I just emailed a couple days ago. I emailed Mark with the information for the new issue, so that'll go out through Diamond. as well. I don't understand really the logistics of. I know everything happens far in advance, so I'm not sure when it will actually hit their catalog. I think in the fall or something crazy. But yeah, it will be available through Diamond as well. And as long as I can keep doing that, I'm happy to do it.
And I think we got an email notification because we're on their media list from Mark saying that now King Cat Comics is going to be part of our co-op.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, with 75, I thought well, this is it's worth a shot and see what happens. And to me, it's. I mean, I will say, I price my stuff in a way that once you start going through a place like Diamond, I'm not making a whole lot of money, but I'm not really losing any money. But I am, hopefully, like I said, it's getting the zine out into places that it just wouldn't otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, that's that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. I think Andy's question that he started off with about how people come to you, or maybe if they were introduced to your work through issue 75 of King Cat, and then see this latest issue, what kind of a different reaction might there be? Because I was thinking that I'm wondering what kind of difference you may have experienced from readers who are introduced to your work through those collections that you've put out, like the King Cat Classics or Map of My Heart, and they are introduced to your work that way, and then learn that they can, either at a local shop or by contacting you, get the issues of the mini King Cat Comics and Stories. Have you noticed that there's a difference in reaction, whether someone starts with the minis or starts with the collections?
That's a good question. I mean, definitely. I mean, at this point, I guess there's been the two real King Cat collections. There's King Cat Classics and Map of My Heart, and they're just consecutive collections. The King Cat Classics has stuff from issues 1 through 50, and Map of My Heart is 51 through 61. So I think there was there might have been a real, what kind of moment for a lot of people who were familiar with my kind of mature work, I guess you could possibly call it, and then picked up King Cat Classics, where it's a very different thing, very, very different animal. It's was very spontaneous, very scratchy, kind of crude in a lot of places. But, I mean, to me, that's part of what I've always wanted to do, is I just want this thing to represent wherever I am at whatever particular point I am in my life as kind of honestly and straightforward as possible. So I think mostly people, I think they may be a little bit surprised if they pick up something that's not what they were expecting. But I think I would hope that if somebody sticks with it and kind of digs into it a little bit, they start to see the kind of through threads, that run through it, however it looks or whatever the story subject matter may be of a particular comic. I do think that taken as a whole, or in a little bit larger, with a little bit bigger perspective, maybe some of those kind of themes that have carried through the work all these years start, become apparent.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for the past 10, 15 years, I felt that if I see a John Porcellino comic, I can identify a John Porcellino comic. But you're right. If I was going back and looking at the King Cat Classics collection, and the really early stuff especially is very different in terms of your style especially. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as the artist, when did you feel that you had latched on to a style that I think most people like me would say, that's Porcellino?
Well, I would say, and part of the reason when I did the first book, the King Cat Classic book, it ends at 50 again because it's a nice round number, and it's like, oh, wow, 1 through 50. Okay, that's great. But also, was probably around that point of issue 50, which would have been 1996, I think, where I think I had worked out some of that stuff and come to a point where, like, it's funny to say, I mean, that King Cat Classics, originally I envisioned it as 2 volumes, and the first volume would contain stuff from issues 1 through 30, and the second would be 31 through 50, because both issues 30 and 50, I felt, were kind of what I call, they were kind of hinge issues, where, like, you know, the continuum kept moving forward, but there was a little bit of a bend in the path there. And at issue 30, it was where I began trying to write stories that were a little bit more open-ended at times, or maybe a little bit more about, rather than documenting events, let's say, in my life, but documenting kind of the emotional experience of those events, or the feeling in many ways. Like the comics at that point sometimes were less about just telling some autobiographical story, like, you know, here's this funny thing that happened to me, but really the stories could be a lot more vague, you know, or they could there were stories that were just about feelings, that nothing actually happened narratively within the comic, but it was more about the feeling that I was trying to convey. And similarly, around issue 50 is where I started to really, I mean, of course it was a gradual thing, but where I started to kind of really pare things back and started to get interested in ideas like, you know, how what's the minimum requirement that I need to put down on this page in order to convey to the reader what I'm trying to convey, both text-wise and also in terms of the artwork. And so I would say that about that time of issue 50 is when maybe that idea that people have of King Cat is this kind of minimalist, really kind of precise approach probably started to become more consciously part of what I was after.
Okay.
So I maybe around then, but I mean, and at this point, you know, and it's the way everything works, you know, the first part, there's the development part of any human being or any creative process or anything, where things expand really quickly and they kind of, you have all these spurts and, like, you know, all this energy, and then gradually that growth spurt slows down, and then you start, you know, you're just building on all that stuff that came before. So to me, even though it may be so subtle that you can't notice it issue to issue if you're a reader, but to me, I mean, it's still, of course, evolving, the way I draw and the way I write. So, you know, that's what keeps it kind of interesting to me, although I'm sure that the refinements that I'm dealing with now, or the changes, are so tiny, like little tiny increments at a time, that it may be hard to notice. But hopefully, you know, when the next couple collections come out and you see a big span of these stories all in a row, maybe, you know, people will be able to pick up on the evolution that's hopefully, you know, that I feel is still going on.
You know, when you were talking about that idea of kind of not only minimalism, but the kind of aiming for an emotional, you know, aiming for the emotion rather than maybe say a narrative. In issue 76, the thing that came to mind to me immediately was the one-page story, you know, Lord, I Just Can't Keep From Crying. That's just basically 3 panels, and you know, it's the text is, we were driving down Riverside. I was slumped in the back seat, looking out at the passing shops. I saw the old lady in Man, Window Booth, Morning Glory Restaurant, and then that's it. And And in looking, when you cite the date of the event and the date that it was created, you've got the event having taken place in 2010, and you drew it in 2015. What I was wondering, kind of, since we're on the topic of process too, was that moment something that in 2010 you kind of noted as being, oh, this could be a possible moment in a comic I do, or was it something that, in 2015 you just remembered this brief moment and recorded it as a comic?
Well, I can't remember exactly in that particular case how it went, but it could have been any number of those. I feel like oftentimes, like, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and write something on the back of a receipt while I'm still half asleep. And I'll find it, underneath the, nightstand or something a year later. Well, I shouldn't say a year. That gives away too much about my house cleaning capability. Maybe a couple of days later, a week later. How's that?
Okay.
I'll find this
for
receipt,
the record, a couple of days later.
Flip it over and be like, oh, okay, I don't even remember writing this, but yeah, okay. So that happens sometimes. It also, when something happens, sometimes it is really immediately clear to me, like, I want to write a comic about this. It doesn't mean I'm going to write a comic about it that night, and that's one of the big differences, I think, between the early King Cat and what I'm doing now, is that the early years, that's how I worked. I would have driven past that man and woman in the window seat at that restaurant, and I would have gone home that night and drawn the comic. Nowadays, things percolate a little bit more, and I kind of digest them a little bit more oftentimes. Sometimes I still work a little quicker or more spontaneously, but more often than not now, I'll kind of file away that memory somewhere, whether it's actually like on the back of a receipt or an envelope, which I do a lot, or I'll just it'll be somewhere in my brain. I'll find those scraps of paper, and then I have a notebook that I just keep all my ideas in and stuff, and I'll transcribe the stuff from the back of an envelope into the notebook, so I have it all in one place. And so in that case, I want to say that did find like a receipt with that story on the back of it, but that sometime fairly recently. But while I'm working on an issue, it usually seems really chaotic, and I'm uncertain about what things are going to be. And then as I work on it, so usually there's kind of an aha moment where I kind of sense what the issue is going to be about, because oftentimes there is a kind of thematic thread that goes through them. Again, it might be a theme that's so subtle or esoteric that I may be the only one who really knows it's there. So in this case, the way that story connected was there are a couple themes in this issue. One is winter. Mm-hmm. Another one is a loneliness. Mm-hmm. And another is kind of a perseverance in the face of loneliness or sadness or something. So the Morning Glory restaurant story that you're describing is something that happened to me when I first moved to the area where I live now, and it was I don't want to sound melodramatic. It was a really bad time in my life. It probably was the lowest point of my life. I had gone through my second divorce. I was completely broke. I had moved cross country for a variety of hopeful reasons that none of which panned out. And I found myself living in this really rough place in a town, a really rough, weird little town that I knew nobody. I was completely alone. And so the the Morning Glory restaurant was just a memory that I had of kind of driving down one of these shitty, can I say shitty? So it's, shitty streets in a kind of rundown town, probably piles of, dirty snow stacked up along the side, and looking at this old, diner and seeing this elderly couple sitting quietly eating their meal or whatever, and it was very expressed how I felt, at the time. And so, then there's another story in this issue about sitting in a Winchell's donut shop and trying to work on comics in the window booth in the snow. And, so little things like that kind of build upon themselves, or these little connections start to appear in my head. And then I get all excited and I tell my girlfriend, who's a photographer, grab your camera, let's go down to Loves Park and take a picture of the Morning Glory restaurant. I'll put it on the cover of the new issue or whatever. And just once those kind of things start to gel, that's when the issue kind of takes a life of its own. And I really get a sense of where it's going and what it's going to be. So that's a little bit, if any of that makes sense. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of babbling, but the process now of me making a King Cat is it's longer, it's more thoughtful than it was in the early days, and it's more like I'm willing to wait for these things to kind of gestate. Like I'm willing for these ideas. I'm willing to wait until these ideas kind of come together and form themselves, rather than hurriedly putting them down on paper immediately, or, and putting them out in the world right away. So that, I guess that's one example of the way it works for me nowadays.
Well, you mentioned something about the way you used to work quicker. You'd have an experience or something, write it down, and then you translate that into comic form. One of the things I've noticed about your earlier stuff is that you wrote a lot about your dreams. Mm-hmm. And in fact, this latest issue of King Cat Comics begins with a dream. Mm-hmm. And then you wake up after the first few panels. I'm fascinated to know if you still take note of your dreams, and then when you do, or when you did write down your dreams or take note of them and then illustrate them, how meticulous would that become?
Well, I mean, those early dream comics, to me, especially at that point, I was fascinated by the dream life, and I looked at dreams as a way to have experiences personally that you're just not going to have during your waking hours, right? But the experiences could be just as profound, or just as revealing, or they were fascinating. And so I would write those dream comics. I would write them the same way I would any other autobio comic, which, especially at those early days, it was kind of journalistic. Like, I tried to make them as accurate as possible to what really happened, So I tried to document the experiences as directly and, in a straightforward way, without fussing with it too much. What happened to me over time is, actually, looking back on it, is that I went through a period where I stopped dreaming. I have a metabolic disorder called pyroluria, which results in a lot of things. But I mean, fundamentally, you become super deficient in vitamin B6, which is integral to like melatonin and deep sleep and dream states and things like that. So, physically, I just didn't have the stuff in me to let me dream anymore for a long time. And so I stopped doing dream comics, Occasionally I would still have dreams that I could remember, and they would still filter their way into the comics here and there, but I stopped using the dreams in a more literal, direct, journalistic, documentary sense like I had earlier, and started using them a little bit more metaphorically, So I'd have some kind of dream, and I'd think about how it related to what was going on in my life or some emotion or some idea, and I would use it kind of as a tool to investigate those emotions. Mm-hmm. And so, nowadays there's a few dreams here and there that I still use in the comics, but it's just a lot less than in the past, for whatever reason. I will admit that, the other thing too is when I started doing King Cat, there were no podcasts, right? There were no, the Comics Journal wasn't talking about zines, so there wasn't all the hoo-ha surrounding comics that there is now, where that's a roundabout way of introducing that. At some point you realize, people bitch about autobiographical comics, another story about blah, blah, blah. And people definitely bitch about, oh, God, dream comics. That's the worst, who cares about somebody else's dream? And I kind of get that to a certain extent. I think if you're an autobiographical cartoonist or artist of any stripe, you're constantly walking this really treacherous line between appearing just purely solipsistic, navel-gazing, self-obsessed person, and the line there is that there's a way of writing or communicating about your own experiences that becomes universal, where the audience can become immersed in it themselves and then gain insight about their own lives. And that's the great thing to me about autobiographical work and the thing I love about it. But it is it's a tricky line to walk. And so, probably my journals, for instance, and the notebooks for King Cat are filled with a lot of dream stuff. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they ever make it to printed form where people are going to be reading them is less likely nowadays than it was in the past for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
But there's still. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I can see what you're saying, that some people could think that, comics or autobiographical comics, especially about dreams, could be maybe self-indulgent. But I don't know. One of the reasons why I asked that question a moment ago was, I used to keep a dream diary. I didn't illustrate it. I'm not an artist. But I found, and I remember when I started to keep it, it was because of a course that I had in college called Personality Theory, and my professor mentioned that was a way that, that he as a therapist had suggested that some people get to know themselves a little better. So I
Absolutely.
thought, hey, I'll do that. And I loved it at first because I could not remember my dreams at that time. But the more that I wrote down, it's kind of like when you first start exercising, right? You do a little and then you can do a little more. And before I knew it, I was all pumped, so to speak, when it came to my dreams. So much so that I would spend, at times it seemed like almost half the morning writing down as much detail as possible, and it became almost an obsession with me, so I kind of tapered back on that. But it did allow me a glimpse inside. So I'm fascinated by that process, and you felt that it helped you writing those comics about your dreams to understand what you were going through at the time.
Absolutely. And what you just said, I completely agree with. For me, this art, these comics it's a twofold thing. Like, one, I'm trying to understand myself through the process of making these things. I'm trying to understand my life. And that's the interior side of it. And then the exterior side of it is that I'm hoping to share what I find there with other people. And so like a dream journal or any kind of journal is really helpful in that, for me, my experience with that kind of stuff, and this kind of jumps into the larger thing of having drawn autobiographical comics for 30 years or whatever, is that the comics themselves become a great tool for you as an individual to be able to look back. You know, essentially King Cat is a 27-year or whatever it is journal where I can look back and see where I was at any given point in my life. I can start to see those threads that run through your life that are so subtle that, you don't really notice them from moment to moment until you start to look back and you see all these patterns. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, look at this. And then, here 2 years later, here's the same thing or whatever. And so, it's a great tool for self-critique. And, and like you said, even if you're not making comics or art or whatever out of them, just as a human being, it's such a fascinating and really productive tool to use to kind of figure out what's going on with you. It's like a dream journal or any kind of journal, just a day-to-day diary kind of journal. I think it all really does help. And of course, from the outside, it could look like total self-obsession or whatever. But, I think that ultimately it gives you the potential for, a more nuanced approach to life and interacting with people. So, when I talk about people who like roll their eyes at autobiographical comics and stuff like that, like, of course, I don't feel that way at all. I mean, I understand, and I've seen plenty of autobiographical comics that just kind of don't have that extra thing that lets them break through, right, to a more universal kind of interactive experience with the audience. But even just for the person doing them, it's got to be beneficial, right? So, I'm one of these people. I've always been fascinated by real life. That's my whole what I'm after with my work is kind of understanding life to the extent that I can. And, to the point where I prefer documentaries in films. When I read, it's mostly essays, it's mostly biographies, autobiographies, journalism. I'm a nonfiction kind of guy, and so, some people are wired one way or another, and I'm wired towards that way of like, I'm fascinated by the experience of being a human being in this universe. And so whether it's my own work, that's one thing, but I also just enjoy reading and hearing other people's stories.
I had a couple things from that, but I just feel like I wanted to mention that I just finished writing a book about autobiographical comics, and I get the sense that Derek keeps fucking with me by having me read more autobiographical comics for the podcast. Like I spent 18 months reading only autobiographical comics, but
that's the plan.
But that's a plan. But one of the things that, John, with your work, when you talked about that idea of connection, one of the things I think a lot about with your work, when I'm reading it, is where my sense of connection to it comes from. Because, when I read and reread a book like Perfect Example, that feels so close to my own teenage experience in the 80s. With that kind of, disaffectedness, but also the music you're listening to in there and so on. Like all that just really connects. And so with Perfect Example, it feels like there's a very kind of direct, almost kind of one-to-one connection there. Whereas what you're talking about in a kind of bigger sense is this also that how do you tell an autobiographical story that universalizes itself to the reader, so that you're not just writing to the mid 40s white suburban kid who listen to alternative music.
Well, yeah, Perfect Example was interesting because that was the first. Well, a couple issues before I did the Perfect Example stories, I did the comic called Belmont Harbor, which ended up in the Perfect Example book, and that was like 18 pages or something. I remember when I did that, I was like, "Oh my god! Like I can't believe this! Look at this 18-page story. It's unheard of." and that was kind of the inspiration for me to pull out that Perfect Example story, which again, this was a story that I worked on for like 10 years off and on. The stuff in Perfect Example happened in the summer of '86, and it was the summer of '96 when I was finally sat down and put out the first issue of it, and finally got it down on paper and out into people's hands. And so Belmont Harbor kind of inspired me a little bit. Like, okay, I pulled off an 18-page comic. That felt really good. Let's see what I can do about that big story, which, again, I still call it a big story. It's like 72 pages, it's no blankets, right? But it's for me, it's a big story, right? And, this was about the time where I started to get a little bit self-conscious about what I was doing. And I remember wondering, like, okay, like, how do I pull off this, 72 pages about the dumb stuff that happened to me when I was 17 years old, or 16 years old, or however old I was at that point, without just being self-indulgent. And I mean, part of the Perfect Example thing that made me feel a little more comfortable or ease into it was that I did have that idea that, well, everybody has these experiences. What I'm going to be writing about in this story, obviously the details are different, but I'm writing about like having crushes on people. I'm writing about disappointment and disillusionment. I'm writing about that moment between high school and college, that first summer where you're not really sure, like something just ended, but the next thing hasn't really begun and you're not really sure what it's going to be. And I realized that those were all kind of universal experiences that people have. And so that helped me feel a little bit more comfortable diving into it, and telling that story and stretching it out and kind of getting into the nitty gritty of it. Yeah, and of course there are a lot of people who will write to me and be like, wow, I can't believe you were like riding down the hill on your skateboard listening to Husker Du or whatever. Like I did the same thing, But then there's also plenty of, 16-year-old kids nowadays who read that book and, they can still find ways to relate to that story because it's a universal kind of, it's a coming of age story, I mean, it's not, too groundbreaking on that level. So
when I first opened that book, and talk about those sorts of things, and you've got the John P. and Harold J. and Live Evil. The discussion. I mean, that may be another one of those. Well, maybe more of a kind of mid '80s experience of having the argument of who is better, this this alternative band or this metal band.
Yeah.
That was such a common recess moment.
the great punk versus metal dichotomy. I think we're all still dealing with that a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. Funny story and gives an idea of the times, and I still never found out what happened at that concert, so I don't know who's better.
Well, you write about this, especially in your earlier comics, about being a member of a band, and that was a big part of your life, which you don't have that anymore. But music, I mean, how does music make its way into your comics now? And do you feel that that even indirectly it still plays a big part in whatever you create?
Yeah, I mean, music, sometimes I think about it and I want to say this and I'm like, well, I don't know if that's really true. But in some ways I actually think that probably I'm more inspired, or maybe I get a lot from music, almost more than other comics or whatever. Like, music is a huge inspiration for me for King Cat. Not only in the approach to writing the stories, but in the way that I put the issues together and stuff. And I always think about this. There's a cartoonist named Jenny Zerbakis who, she's still doing it, but in the 90s she was a little more prolific. And she did a comic called Strange Growths. And one of my favorite comics of all time. And I remember I learned a lot from her, and her comics were very poetic. But the thing that, like, the way I ultimately learned to describe them to people is that they seemed like songs. Like, there was a lyrical quality to the comics. But even just like basic things, like I could name a bunch of them, but there's like this comic I always think of she did called "You Broke Your Own Heart." I remember being just like, wow, that's like a great song title, but it's not the title of a song, it's the title of a comic. Mm-hmm. And her work was that way. So for a person who is a musician and like really involved in, writing music, putting out records, performing, as I was, her comics were kind of a guide for me as a way of uniting those two mental states, those two mentalities. And so, I think about King Cat musically in those kind of esoteric ways where, even to the point where I've described this before to other people, but like I look at an issue of King Cat as like an album to me. So you've got this series of songs. You've got the cover. That's the album cover. You've got the back cover. You've got this, like, it starts out with this little bit introductory thing that kind of establishes the themes or whatever of the record. And ideally, even if they're not like specifically thematically linked, the songs on an album are linked in terms of the time period, the songwriting, where it's at, the musicians who are on the album, the recording studio. It has a certain cohesive tone to it, usually, And so that's why I think about an issue of King Cat. And so I work on these stories and like connect things thematically and try to put them together in a way that creates a kind of holistic experience that is hopefully a little, larger than the sum of its parts. But a lot of it is just like, actual nitty gritty stuff. Like I'll have, X number of comics, but only 32 pages. So, it's like, okay, I've got to sequence this issue in a way that works. And sometimes through no fault of its own, a comic just doesn't fit, and it ends up being an outtake, right? And you cut that one out, and then, I usually start the issue, like I start to slowly build these themes. And I want the comics to refer back and forth to each other. You don't want to have like too many slow songs in a row, right? You know, you want to like kind of put some variation in there so you keep the audience's attention. And I mean, also, you know, so to me, it's ended up this way where I kind of stick the letters column or the top 40 pages in the kind of in the middle of the book. It may not physically be the middle of the book, but you know, that's the point where side A ends and you have to get up and flip the record over, put the needle back down. And side B is the second half of the issue, which is still referring and connected to that first half, but also kind of has a life of its own in a way. You know, the individual sides have their own lives as well. And, I mean, maybe that sounds a little crazy, but that's absolutely how I think about making an issue of King Cat, you know. So not only the individual comics to me are really informed by music, but just the whole process of making a zine, you know, making an issue of King Cat is musical to me.
You know, frying up burgers in my cold, miserable apartment alone, listening to sports radio is my favorite Tom Waits song.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting to talk about that, because I often think about that. That's yet another kind of aspect of, well, I mean, it goes back past the 80s, but I always remember, you know, like REM would title it each side of its album, give it a different title, or, you know, even something as extreme as like what Neil Young would do, where each side would be, you know, a cohesive sound, but they would be different, like in Trans, I guess, or What Rest Never Sleeps.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's the way I look at these things, you know, and I certainly listen to. I don't want to sound. I certainly listen to a lot more music than I read comics. You know, I love comics. I love reading them and stuff. But to me, music is just it's just so important to me. You know, I mean, you know, the thing with, you know, my ears went bad, I guess, when I was like 26 or so. I can't remember the exact time. And so, you know, up to that point, I had played in bands. I had a record label. I was doing the Spit and Half distro. I was doing King Cat, making my comics. And I viewed all these things, you know, all those creative things to me were all kind of parts of this whole, you know, this life. And when my ears went bad, I just couldn't continue playing music, and I was always grateful that I had comics to, I don't know, to fall back on is the wrong word, because I viewed them both equally. You know, they're both equally important parts of what I did, but I was also really aware, like, wow, okay, so I can't play music anymore. I've been playing music for 15 years or something like that, and now I can't anymore. So it wasn't like, well, what do I do? It was like, okay, well, you know, drawing comics is pretty quiet most of the time, you know, and so, you know, I feel lucky that I had that to focus on. And I think that was a big changing point. That was around issue 50 as well. And so it was a time in my life of great change. And, you know, that's when I was no longer playing music and recording and writing songs and stuff. That's when I really began to focus more on on bringing those musical ideas into the comics.
Well, if your individual issues of King Cat Comics are like albums that have a variety of different songs in terms of, you know, the speed, the tone, the message, well, what do you call something like the Hospital Suite that you referred to earlier with those three really longer stories? Is that something like a concept album?
Yeah, that's my triple live album. Yeah, I mean, the Hospital Suite was just, it was obviously a huge story, and the way, again, originally, like I planned those 3 stories to be individual books. And part of this was just trying to figure out a way to approach doing the zine and doing the books with D&Q and stuff, where I had and have these longer stories that I am going to dig into and do someday, that would work as kind of in a book form, you know. So like the Hospital Suite, I think it's like 100 pages or something like that. So originally I envisioned that the story of the Hospital Suite that's within the larger book called the Hospital Suite. The title track. I imagine that just being like 100-page little graphic novella that would be followed by this one called, 1998, that would be followed a year later or something. And there are a couple partially I didn't want to. I knew that the stories in that book were rough. There's no getting around it. And the way I wanted to tell the stories was a very warts and all, just like spit it out on the page without prettying it up or getting too poetic with it or whatever. And I really didn't want to be the guy that every fall, wow, here's a new book about this terrible stuff that happened to John. I just kind of, at some point when I really was working on it, I was like, I just want this all out in one fell swoop, just put it out there and be done with it. But again, it was almost like an issue of King Cat where there were these 3 stories, and I really did view them as individual stories, right? Like I wrote them individually at different times in my life, and I realized, like I said, that the 3 of them kind of together formed an arc, but they were also independent from each other. And so, that was one of the tricks with that book was like, how do I tell these 3 stories that actually overlap in some ways, but definitely are self-referential? Mm-hmm. How do I put these together in one story? So, it is an odd little book in some ways. Like the Hospital Suite story is a little bit different, where it is a little more like it's in my head what's what I call expansive, where like I'll take 3 or 4 pages to document, a 10-second moment of life. Mm-hmm. Whereas the second 2 stories were more concentrated, right? There's like a lot of story in those pages. And again, some of that is just stylistic, but some of it too is like the True Anxiety story. That spans age 4 to age 44 or whatever. And to put 40 years of life into, to do it in that expansive way that I did the first story, it would have been a 2-volume Blankets.
Yeah. Well,
and so, so you approach each comic differently depending on what you think, what it needs. And so there's a little bit of a variation there in the storytelling techniques, but still the 3 stories go together.
Yeah, I'm wondering now, after hearing you say this, that you had thought initially about publishing those 3 stories in the book Hospital Suite separately, like a trilogy, what the effect would have been of reading them individually. Because I can only imagine the effect of coming to the very end of the story, the Hospital Suite. It's like hitting a wall suddenly, and it's like, that's it? An experience like that in reading would beg the need for a follow-up.
Well, see, I like telling stories. I like stories that hit the wall, mm-hmm. right? And especially in the early days when I was doing these kind of strictly autobiographical stories or whatever. Part of my approach to it was that I wanted to write about certain experiences, but also particularly certain little moments that may be so slight or subtle that you don't even realize they're happening as they happen. And I wanted to focus in on those. And so part of what I would do with those early stories is I would kind of really almost arbitrarily, like, choose a starting point and then choose an ending point. And I would, launch the first panel would start in the middle of the action, and I wouldn't really explain where I was or who the people I was with were or what was going on. And it would go through whatever 6 panels or 8 panels or 12 panels, and then, something would happen, and that was the end. You turn the page and there was another story. And the idea was that these little moments on their own may not seem like much, even though, looking at them really intensely the way I did, you realize really quickly that actually these little tiny, seemingly insignificant moments are loaded with information and experience and emotion and ideas. But the idea that then you pile a bunch of those little experiences up and it tells this larger story. So the same way, life doesn't, it's a cliche, but life doesn't always have a cut and dried ending. Mm-hmm. Funny, and, a beautiful climactic, epiphany at the end of every experience. That's what I wanted my comics to be able to represent. Like, not, life isn't that way, but when you look at it from the big picture, spread out over years and time, it takes on this kind of monumental quality. Well, I suppose that was maybe a funny ending to that story.
What you were saying reminds me of this most recent issue of King Cat Comics, and the story that Andy mentioned a moment ago, memory of frying up burgers in my cold, miserable apartment, alone listening to sports radio. And the way that ended, I thought that when I turned the page to the next comic, Fall Signs, I didn't feel at first that it was a separate comic, because you're coming home and you see the cat and the cat's meowing, and then we have these 4 panels that, goldenrod's up, crows start to gather in trees and fields. And at first I thought this was a continuation of that. But then it occurred to me, oh no, this is a separate comic itself, Fall Signs. And so that has that effect that you were just describing about ending your stories in certain ways that, juxtaposed one to the other, can create a particular effect.
Yeah, and I do think about that. There's a lot. Anybody who's a cartoonist you talk to they'll tell you how subtle these kind of things get. But when I talk about sequencing this issue or whatever, those are things that I really work on. And you can't pull it off 100% every time. There's always compromises. But I try to segue the comics, the end of one comic into the beginning of the next comic. All those segues and juxtapositions are all, they're not planned, because I don't write the stories with the idea this one's going to follow that one. But I end up with this pile of stories, and I sit, and it's like rearranging this puzzle until all the pieces fit together the best that they can. And so I really work to connect those stories. And again, it's probably pretty esoteric, but I whether it's just rhythmically or thematically or different, ways of connecting these things, those connections I try to put into the comics.
Well, so issue number 76 is the most recent. So what is the process from one issue of King Cat Comics and Stories to the next? Do you already have number 77 in mind, or is this something that is still fermenting?
In this case, I have 77 is completely ready to draw, and I already have like 4 pages penciled and inked and done. And so some of this, in this case, it was probably a result of issue 75 took me so long that meanwhile, while I was working on the Maisie issue, number 75, these other ideas were percolating in the back of my head and kind of coming to fruition. And so by the time 75 came out, I had a lot of ideas down on paper to figure out, to choose from where I was going to go to next. And so it happens that like some of the stories that would have made it into 76 that were like the outtakes that didn't fit thematically or whatever, I realized that I'm carrying those over to 77, and I've worked out a selection of things for that issue. So that issue is actually ready to go as far as sitting down and drawing it. But because of the nature of what I do, like I just put this new issue out, and so I got my Patreon copies out last week. Yesterday I mailed all the subscribers copies, and starting today and then the rest of into next week is when I'll be doing store orders, and I have stores that I work with that have standing orders, and I invoice the stores and do all that. So like there's just like a lot of practical busy work that goes into doing this as well, and so I'll get all that stuff done. It usually takes about a month or so to get all that stuff taken care of. And then I might take a break and work on a few other things, some commissioned artwork or something, and then I'll sit down and start working on the next issue. So I actually have the next couple issues on paper. It doesn't always work out that far in advance, but I think because I worked on 75 for so long, and before that, the hospital suite. So I had these two large projects that took a ton of time that, I had all this other stuff going on as well. I creatively in the back of my head while I was working on those. So I kind of have a stack of stories ready to get out.
And we should mention to our listeners if they can't find your comic anywhere locally, then they can definitely find it at your online store, Spit and a Half.
Yeah, spitandhalf.com. And it's a distribution company. I started in 92, and at this point it's gotten huge. I think I have got over 700 titles or so in stock. So besides my own work, it's all kinds of cool comics from all over the world in one web store. So yeah, my stuff is available that way as well.
Well, John, I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with us on the Comics Alternative about King Cat and other things as well. So the most recent issue of King Cat Comics and Stories number 76, definitely our listeners should check it out.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a fun and interesting interview, and that's the kind of interview I really like doing on this show, where we got to drill deep into John's technique, his sensibility, and his approach to doing his comics, and I got a lot out of that.
Yeah, I did as well, and it surprises me that we're about 4 years old as a podcast, and we are just now getting John Porcellino on the show for an interview. This just seems like a no-brainer. He should have been on the show the first few months because to me it just seemed like a perfect fit.
Yeah.
But better late than never. Again, we want to thank John for taking the time and talking with us. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And if you want to find out more about the work of John Porcellino, well, you can get some of his books at really good discounts through our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. As Andy told you guys at the top of the show, right now you can find Map of My Heart at 25% off cover price through DCB Service, and then the Hospital Suite, which we talked about quite a bit, at 30% off. So definitely check those out. You can also check out spitandhalf.com and get individual copies of the last several issues of King Cat Comics and Stories.
That's right.
And then after you do get your comics at those places, Porcellino and otherwise, be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about the interview. If you go to the website comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
We also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. Check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. You can also listen to us on Spotify and, if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But, as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
So all the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And we've got more fun interviews in the weeks to come, so be sure to check it out. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.